Welcome back to our channel for another deep dive into the scintillating drama of Los Angeles. Today is a phenomenal day to unpack the latest explosive developments from the world of high fashion, where family loyalty and corporate greed constantly collide. Settle in as we explore a monumental turning point that will forever alter the legacy of Forrester Creations. The hallowed halls of Forrester Creations have long been a battleground for the warring factions of the Forrester and Logan dynasties. But the recent escalation has pushed the legendary fashion house to the absolute brink of destruction. For weeks, the tension has been mounting with suffocating intensity, fueled by Steffy Forrester Finnegan's relentless campaign to marginalize Hope Logan Spencer and her deeply cherished hope for the future line. The corporate maneuvering reached a fever pitch when Brooke Logan Forrester, radicalized by her daughter's suffering, launched a desperate and aggressive bid to seize the co-CEO chair. It was a power play born not merely of ambition, but of a fierce maternal instinct to protect her child's legacy from Steffy's tyrannical reign. However, the ultimate arbiter of this bitter conflict, Ridge Forrester, was forced to make a definitive choice, a choice that would inevitably shatter one side of his deeply divided family. Ridge Forrester, a man who has historically vacillated between the women in his life, found himself trapped in a suffocating dilemma of his own making. Despite the prophetic warnings from Carter Walton regarding the catastrophic consequences of alienating the Logans, Ridge ultimately succumbed to the weight of his Forrester bloodline. In a decision that echoed through the executive suites like a death knell, Ridge declared that Steffy would retain absolute power as the sole co-CEO alongside him. He systematically dismantled Brooke's dreams of shared leadership and, in doing so, officially sanctioned Steffy's ruthless corporate strategy. By validating his daughter's authority, Ridge did not just reject his wife's professional aspirations. He effectively signed the exile orders for the Logan women, stripping them of their influence, their security, and their dignity within the company they had helped build and sustain for decades. For Hope Logan Spencer, the delivery of this devastating news was nothing short of a psychological obliteration. When the reality of Ridge's decree finally settled upon her shoulders, the vibrant, optimistic designer felt the very foundation of her world violently crumble beneath her feet. Hope had dedicated her entire adult life to Forrester Creations, pouring her soul, her creativity, and her unwavering idealism into a brand that championed positivity and progressive values. To realize that the man she had long viewed as a paternal figure, the man who had shaped her understanding of family and loyalty, would so callously choose corporate cruelty over fundamental justice was a betrayal of unfathomable proportions. The sheer magnitude of Ridge's abandonment pierced through Hope's heart, leaving a gaping void where her faith in the Forrester patriarch had once resided. Driven by a desperate, agonizing need for closure and a final, definitive answer, Hope stormed into the executive CEO office, the very epicenter of Steffy's newly consolidated empire. The atmosphere in the room was instantly thick with venomous hostility. Steffy sat behind the grand desk, her posture radiating an arrogant, untouchable superiority. Beside her stood Ridge, his demeanor a pathetic mixture of defensive posturing and cowardly avoidance. Hope, her voice trembling with a potent cocktail of rage and profound sorrow, demanded to know the ultimate fate of her career and her beloved fashion line. She refused to be dismissed with vague, corporate platitudes. She demanded the raw, unvarnished truth from the very people who were actively orchestrating her professional demise. Steffy, intoxicated by the absolute validation of her father's ruling, did not offer a shred of empathy or professional courtesy. Instead, she unleashed a torrent of condescension, her words dripping with a chilling, calculated cruelty. Steffy made it abundantly clear that hope for the future was not merely paused, but effectively eradicated from the Forrester Creations portfolio to make way for Eric Forster's couture. She looked down at Hope not as a colleague or a stepsister, but as a vanquished enemy who had finally been eradicated from the premises. Steffy's eyes, cold and unyielding, communicated a brutal message. The Logan era at Forrester Creations was officially over, and Hope was nothing more than an unwelcome relic of a bygone time. As Steffy's venomous words echoed off the walls of the executive suite, a profound and terrifying physical transformation began to overtake Hope. The relentless stress of the past several months, the constant belittling, the deliberate sabotage of her life's work, the agonizing deterioration of her mother's marriage, and the sheer emotional exhaustion of fighting an unwinnable war, suddenly culminated in a catastrophic physiological response. The air in the spacious office seemed to evaporate, leaving Hope gasping for breath as a suffocating tightness gripped her chest. The vibrant colors of the room began to bleed into a muted, dizzying gray, and the triumphant sound of Steffy's voice warped into a distant, unintelligible hum. Hope tried to steady herself, her trembling hands reaching out for the edge of a nearby chair, but her motor functions were rapidly failing her. The profound emotional trauma had short-circuited her physical endurance. In a terrifying, slow-motion sequence that seemed to defy gravity itself, Hope's eyes rolled back, her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed violently onto the cold, unforgiving floor of the CEO office. The sickening thud of her body hitting the ground shattered the tense silence of the room, an abrupt and horrifying punctuation to the bitter corporate dispute. Hope lay entirely motionless, a fragile, broken doll discarded at the feet of the victorious Forrester dynasty. For a fleeting, agonizing moment, the sheer shock of the event paralyzed the room. Then, true to the callous nature that had defined her recent reign, Steffy's immediate reaction was one of disdainful skepticism. Viewing everything through the distorted lens of their bitter rivalry, Steffy scoffed, rolling her eyes in profound irritation. She genuinely believed that Hope's sudden collapse was nothing more than a pathetic, theatrical performance, a cheap, manipulative tactic designed to elicit sympathy and guilt from Ridge. "Oh, please, Hope, stop the theatrics," Steffy sneered, her voice laced with venom, utterly convinced that the Logan woman was stooping to a new low to win a lost argument. But as the seconds ticked by in agonizing slow motion, the reality of the situation began to dawn on Ridge with horrifying clarity. He stepped forward, his initial annoyance rapidly evaporating into a state of absolute, unadulterated panic. Looking down at the floor, Ridge saw that this was no performance. Hope's face was drained of all color, taking on a terrifying, ashen pallor. Her lips were slightly parted, and her chest barely moved with the shallowest, weakest of breaths. The vibrant, passionate young woman he had helped raise was lying unconscious at his feet, completely unresponsive to the world around her. "Hope! Hope!" Ridge yelled, his voice cracking with a sudden, desperate terror that shattered Steffy's arrogant composure. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands shaking violently as he reached out to check her pulse. The pulse was there, but it was erratic and terrifyingly weak. The sheer vulnerability of Hope's unconscious form struck Ridge with the force of a physical blow. In that singular, heart-stopping moment, the corporate spreadsheets, the fashion lines, and the petty family squabbles faded into absolute insignificance. All that remained was the horrifying realization that his actions, his cowardice, and his complicity in Steffy's cruelty had physically broken a woman he professed to care for. From her position behind the mahogany desk, Steffy's smug expression finally faltered. The genuine terror in her father's voice and the stark, undeniable reality of Hope's lifeless appearance pierced through her armor of hostility. A cold chill of apprehension washed over her as she slowly stood up, the magnitude of what had just transpired beginning to settle in her mind. She had wanted to defeat Hope professionally, to assert her dominance and secure her legacy, but she had never intended to push her stepsister to the point of a physical breakdown. The line between ruthless business tactics and genuine human collateral damage had been violently crossed. As emergency medical personnel were frantically summoned to the Forrester building, the atmosphere in the executive suite morphed into a grim, somber vigil. The sight of Hope being carefully lifted onto a stretcher and wheeled out of the office marked a profound and irreversible turning point in the history of the company. It was the tragic, undeniable end of Hope Logan's illustrious career at Forster Creations. The building that had once been her creative sanctuary, the place where she had forged her identity and championed her ideals, had ultimately become the site of her absolute destruction. She was leaving not on her own terms, but as a casualty of a toxic, relentless war. The pristine, sun-drenched sanctuary of the Cliff House has always stood as a vital counterbalance to the cutthroat, labyrinthine corridors of Forster Creations. For John Finn Finnegan and his wife, Steffy Forster Finnegan, the rhythmic crashing of the Pacific Ocean waves against the rocks below has traditionally served as a soothing lullaby, washing away the toxic residue of corporate warfare. The recent return of young Hayes Finnegan to this coastal haven was supposed to be a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. His infectious laughter echoing through the halls brought a brief, brilliant flash of light to a family that has been increasingly suffocated by the dark clouds of boardroom politics. For a fleeting, beautiful moment, Finn and Steffi were allowed to simply be parents, basking in the innocent glow of their child. However, in the world of the Forresters and the Logans, peace is never a permanent resident. It is merely a brief visitor, and the shadow that was about to fall over the Cliff House would prove to be one of the darkest they had ever faced. The illusion of safety was shattered not by a grand declaration of war, but by the insidious, silent arrival of anonymous, threatening letters. They began appearing with a chilling regularity, slipping through the cracks of their carefully curated lives. The tactile reality of these letters, the crisp, unmarked envelopes, the jagged, disguised handwriting, the menacing ambiguity of the words, acted as a psychological poison. For a man like Finn, whose entire existence has been profoundly scarred by the generational trauma inflicted by his biological mother, the psychopathic Sheila Carter, a threat to his family is not merely a cause for concern. It is a trigger for a primal, biological imperative to protect. While Steffi, deeply entrenched in her bitter, all-consuming power struggle with Hope Logan and Brooke Logan Forrester, initially attempted to brush the letters off as the unfortunate, albeit common, hate mail that accompanies high-profile corporate leadership, Finn felt a cold dread settling in his bones. He knew, with the terrifying certainty of a survivor, that these letters were not the work of a disgruntled fashion critic. They were the prelude to a nightmare. The abstract terror of the anonymous letters violently materialized into a horrifying reality on a seemingly ordinary afternoon at the local park. Hayes, the innocent heart of the Finnegan family, was playing under the watchful eye of his nanny, completely oblivious to the predatory gaze fixed upon him. It was here that Remy Price, a man whose very presence radiates a toxic, manipulative darkness, made his move. Remy, who had already demonstrated his capacity for profound psychological cruelty through the devastating deepfake trauma he inflicted upon Electra Forrester, and who is currently holding his own cousin, Melissa Dillon, hostage in a web of vicious blackmail, slithered into the child's orbit. Utilizing his characteristic, unsettling charm, Remy approached the nanny, smoothly introducing himself as a trusted family friend. He lingered just long enough to establish a terrifying proximity to Hayes, a silent, chilling message that he could reach out and touch the most precious thing in Finn and Steffi's world whenever he pleased. When the horrifying details of this park encounter reached Finn, the transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The compassionate, level-headed doctor, a man who has dedicated his life to healing and preserving life, vanished. In his place emerged a fiercely protective father, driven by an ancient, unyielding rage. The realization that a known predator, a man deeply entangled in the darkest, most manipulative corners of Forster Creations, had stood mere inches from his son, breathing the same air, smiling at him under the guise of friendship, shattered Finn's final reserves of patience. The threatening letters were no longer a mystery. They were a manifestation of the poison that Steffy's corporate world had allowed to seep into their personal lives. Finn did not pause to consult security protocols. He did not call a family meeting. He marched out of the hospital, his white coat left behind, his destination clear. He was heading to the epicenter of the chaos, Forster Creations. The atmosphere at Forster Creations was already suffocatingly tense, vibrating with the fallout of Ridge Forster's cowardly leadership and Brooke Logan's relentless, hostile takeover attempt for the co-CEO chair. The design rooms and executive suites were battlegrounds for egos and legacies. But when Finn burst through the heavy glass doors of the building, he brought a completely different, infinitely more dangerous kind of energy. He was a heat-seeking missile, bypassing the bewildered receptionists and ignoring the frantic whispers of the staff. His eyes, usually warm and empathetic, were cold, hard obsidian as he scanned the hallways for his target. When he finally spotted Remy Price, smug, arrogant, and entirely too comfortable within the walls of a company he had no business being in, the explosive confrontation was inevitable. There was no preliminary verbal sparring, no witty banter, and no corporate posturing. Finn closed the distance between them with terrifying speed. Before Remy could even register the danger, before his manipulative smirk could fully form into a greeting, Finn's hands that had performed delicate, life-saving surgeries, grabbed Remy violently by the lapels of his designer jacket. The sheer physical force of the impact sent Remy crashing backward against a reinforced glass partition, the sharp, echoing cracks silencing the entire floor. The physical altercation that followed was raw, visceral, and deeply shocking in the polished, superficial environment of a high-fashion house. Finn, driven by the pure, unadulterated adrenaline of a father protecting his young, physically dominated the blackmailer, his voice a low, terrifying growl as he demanded to know exactly what Remy was doing near his son. Remy, exposed and stripped of his psychological leverage, scrambled defensively, his cowardly nature laid bare under the crushing weight of Finn's righteous fury. The commotion instantly drew the attention of the executive suite. Ridge Forster and Steffy Forster Finnegan, interrupted from their ongoing, bitter debates about the future of the Hope for the Future line, rushed into the hallway. The sight that greeted them was entirely incomprehensible to their corporate-wired brains. Ridge, a man used to solving problems with a sketchbook or a stern conversation, stood paralyzed in absolute horror as he witnessed his usually calm, pacifist son-in-law engaging in a brutal physical brawl. Steffy, whose entire identity is built on control and authority, let out a piercing scream, her heart plummeting into her stomach as she desperately yelled for Finn to stop. The violent shattering of the office's pristine